Today we have the opportunity to sit down with Dr. Ian Kerner. When it comes to the topic of sex, Dr. Kerner is one of the most recognizable voices in the world. He first rose to fame in 2004 for his New York Times best-selling book, She Comes First. In the years that have followed, Kerner's work has been regularly featured in the New York Times, CNN, CBS, and The Atlantic. Over the last 30 years, Kerner has worked with thousands of patients in his clinical practice and has successfully helped both individuals and couples. The conversation we're about to have is so important, partially because sex is such a fundamental aspect of the human experience. For the vast majority of us, the desire to express ourselves sexually is as innate as eating and drinking. But it's also something we really struggle to make sense of. Every day, there are so many narratives and myths flying at us from the surrounding culture that end up having an adverse effect on our sexual health. So in this conversation, we unpack what's actually required to have a healthy and thriving sex life. And that starts with diving into the fascinating science behind sex. So without further ado, Dr. Ian Kerner. All right, Ian, thank you so much for coming into the studio today.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Matthew?
Yeah, Matthew.
Matthew,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, it's been a little bit of a long time coming. We've been planning this for maybe 4 months or so. So
Okay.
Finally to make it happen. Yeah.
Glad to be here. You got me out of my office.
Yeah.
Using public transportation. So, yeah, here we are.
I'm super curious. I mean, we were just talking off camera, and you're saying about 75% of your work as a therapist has kind of a working on the relational sexual nature. Mm-hmm. So if you were to go to a coffee shop in the city, does that and someone asks what you do, do you just say therapist, or does that ever come up sex therapist? I would imagine that kind of would make people's eyes raise or stuff like that.
Yeah, I wouldn't usually say sex therapist. I usually just say psychotherapist. Sometimes I'll say author, and then sometimes people say, well, what do you specialize in? And I'll say I do a lot of couples work, a lot of relational work, and I have a specialization, or I'm, somewhat known for sexuality work. But, over the years, I've gotten tired of sort of being the entertainment at dinner parties and gatherings and whatnot, and having to entertain with stories of couples or whatnot.
Yeah. Is that what happens? People start asking for stories?
Ask for stories or start wanting to give their opinions. I could have written that book that you wrote. I'm the real expert there.
Yeah.
Great. Glad to hear it. You know. But people are endlessly curious about sex.
Yeah.
And often want to hear some of the more vivid tales.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, I mean, the importance of the topic can't be understated. I mean, sexuality is such a core component to the human experience.
Yeah.
And there's this stat that flies around, and I think you did a talk or a little interview with CBS about this, but the idea that men think about sex every 7 seconds. It's hard for me to believe that's actually true, but.
Well, that's an interesting stat, and I don't know if men think about sex every 7 seconds, but most men that I've worked with tend to be in what we would call a spontaneous desire framework, or I call it a reactive desire framework, because a lot of men are reactive to sexual cues of some sort, visual, psychological memories. So I think because men are so reactive in real time to sexual cues, and because I think that those sexual cues metabolize sort of in the body as a kind of a source of arousal, I think that men do much more persistently notice, I wouldn't say think about, but sort of just react to sexual stimuli, and sort of have a leaning towards, and then often have to have obviously a pulling back. So I think that men are definitely in that sort of leaning in, pulling back, much more, I would say, than the average woman, although I hate to generalize, but I think that that's sometimes why also in committed long-term monogamous relationships, men tend to be a little more on the sexually frustrated side, because they're so much more reactive to just sexual stimuli.
I'm really intrigued. Obviously, you see a lot of people in your practice, and I'm sure from a demographic perspective, that's all over the place. But I guess what I'm most interested in is like the mindset of somebody who like comes in to your practice. And so like, where are they in, and I guess where I'm getting at with this is, I think our society has made tremendous progress when it comes to the destigmatization of therapy in general, which is very different than 30, 40 years ago. And so if someone were to be like, I'm going to my therapist today for my mental health. Like, I feel like we're at a point where like nobody would think twice about that. But I guess if you were to tell someone, hey, I'm going to my sex therapist right now, I'd imagine there's probably still some stigma around that. And so do you see people are in like a very desperate state when they come to you, or are they just him being proactive? I'm just explaining. Like, where are they?
No,
at?
I think sometimes being a sex therapist is like being a dentist, because somebody, like with a dentist, the way somebody would be sitting with a toothache, and it sort of just starts off as kind of a background numbing, and then it gets more and more forefront until you're in so much pain. All you want to do is get that tooth pulled out and removed, and you just want to be out of pain. I think that's the state that most people arrive in at sex therapy, that it's something that started off kind of in the background, a dulling, increasing kind of discontentment that now is really acute. And that's why, especially being here in New York, people have such busy schedules and people are over-therapized. I mean, I can't tell you how many people are like, well, we have our daily therapist, we have our couples therapist, we have our specialized trauma therapist, and now we're trying to, fit in, sex therapy. People are so either over-therapized at times or just so busy and really want to get out of pain that I tend to try and take somewhat of a solutions-oriented approach. And the first thing I really want to do in that first session is to try and provide a lot of relief to the individual or the couple who's sitting in front of me, because they are in pain. They have ignored or avoided the topic.
Yeah. I would imagine that like when this dynamic of being over-therapized versus under-therapized, I'd imagine like sex therapy would fall under therapized to an extent.
Yeah.
In the sense that probably a lot of people could benefit from it.
Yeah, well, I also co-founded and co-lead a sex therapy division at a well-known institute here in the city, and so I do a lot of training and supervision of other therapists who want to incorporate sexuality work into their practice, because it tends to be so ignored in school and in most education, and most average good therapists are kind of ill-equipped to handle topics related to sexuality, because sexuality is informed by so many different dimensions: the biological, the psychological, the cultural, the social, the interrelational, the intersectional, and it's usually a combination of all of those different dimensions operating at once. But at the heart of sex therapy has to be an understanding of sexual science and the ability to distill science into a treatment plan.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, I think that's a really good starting point for the conversation, because obviously there's been a lot of advancements with the science behind sex over the past 50 years. And I think what's been discovered is hugely beneficial to the individual, but the likelihood is a lot of people are not familiar with the information or the literature. And so I wanted to start with that. And to an extent, I think many of us have kind of a dysfunctional picture of sex, which is informed by the larger culture or even a religious background, especially when it comes to purity culture and shame and stuff like that. And that really affects our sexuality. And so I think the first thing I want to start talking about is attachment a little bit, attachment theory, which, as we were talking about off camera, a little bit adjacent to sex. And in reading your latest book, I saw the importance of attachment as part of this kind of equation when it comes to sex with a story about Eva
Mm-hmm.
and Andy. And then you also reference your colleague, Dr. Emily Nagosi, in your book quite a bit. And she
Mm-hmm.
wrote, "We can't understand sexual well-being without understanding attachment, and we can't maximize our own sexual well-being without learning how to manage attachment in our relationships." And so for people that are unfamiliar, can you explain a little bit about like what attachment theory is and how that kind of influences sex to some degree?
Well, I mean, I think if you are choosing to be in a long-term monogamous relationship, then relationship health is going to be a requirement, I think, of sexual health, and having a secure relationship, having a trusting relationship, having in the relational style what we would call basically a secure base. And that's what I think from an attachment perspective all of us are hopefully looking to form or evolve into over time, is the ability to form safe, secure attachments. And at the heart of sex and sexual arousal and the human sexual response cycle is an ability to get into flow and to become absorbed and to let go with another person, to inherently make ourselves defenseless. And I think we can only achieve that defenselessness when we do have a secure attachment style. I grew up an only child, and I was a classic latchkey kid here in New York City with a mother who had to work 6, sometimes 7 days a week. And I was an only child, and I learned to take care of myself. So you could certainly say that I had an avoidant attachment style. Now, what does that mean? That means maybe I was shy, maybe I was introverted, maybe I wasn't as adept at relating to other people as someone who grew up in a bigger family might. But I certainly was desperate and interested in connecting. I just was much more comfortable sort of on my own and sort of keeping my hands on my own thermostat and kind of self-regulating distress and emotion. So you would say that I had what would be called a secure avoidant attachment style. Certainly the ability to form attachments and to form trusting relationships, but from the perspective of avoidance. And I happen to marry someone who has what would be considered a secure anxious attachment style. And so she very much, I sometimes like to use the term self-regulate and co-regulate when it comes to attachment style. To what extent do we self-regulate our own emotions? If I hurt myself, to what extent do I manage that myself? If I'm feeling sad or lonely, to what extent do I self-regulate that, versus to what extent someone might be a co-regulator, really needing to bring their distress, bring their internal states to other people to kind of co-mediate and co-regulate. My wife is very much that person. So I think, she would say that after 25 years of being together, she's learned to self-regulate quite a bit better as a result of having been with me. And I've definitely learned to co-regulate and to be much more comfortable with attachment to others.
Yeah, that's really good. Can you share about the story about it? Well, in your latest book, tell me about the last time you had sex. The story about Eve and Andy and like what was going on there, because I think it really helps articulate how that could influence.
Andy and Eva came to see me, and they had very dysfunctional sex lives, and they were really not connecting. And their sex script, or the way a sexual event looked, was extremely constrained and limited by just a couple of sexual behaviors. And as a result, both of them really sort of were living lives of quiet sexual desperation, or actually in their case, not so quiet, but they would really lie in bed next to each other, inches apart, but just feel a million miles apart. And I think at heart, Eva felt that during sex she was being neglected and left behind, and saw Andy as being very, very sexually selfish. And the heart of that feeling of neglect or being left behind did go back to developmental trauma and did go back to childhood issues of feeling very, very dismissed and left behind by her father and brothers in a kind of a very patriarchal sort of feminist environment. And in looking at their sex lives, to sort of loosen up the sex script and to get them to connect, we really had to look at their sex life through the lens of that kind of developmental trauma. And so the work went from sex therapy to trauma work. And I would say we did have a lot of breakthroughs. And the amazing thing is that the sex itself, or the new sex that they were able to discover, became very reparative of those past traumas for Eva. And so I think one of the biggest takeaways from that story is that our sex lives can sort of be a microcosm of so much of what we're bringing in our lived experience, but that the concept of sexual healing is very real, that we can undo trauma through acts of real letting go with another person in real sexual intimacy.
In your latest book, you kind of outlined the 3 factors that kind of make up your sexuality, which is psychological factors, relational factors, biological factors. And we're going to put that up on the screen here for people to look at as we talk this through. So I was kind of looking through those lists because there's kind of these sub-factors that you had listed under that. And if I was trying to do the math, it seemed that like attachment was related to at least kind of like 33% of that equation, or 50% of the equation. And attachment was kind of listed under both psychological and relational factors.
Again, when we're sort of talking about attachment, because you can be very attached to someone and be enmeshed and even be codependent, and that's not necessarily healthy attachment. I think if I were to go back and revise the book a little bit, I'd continue to use the word attachment, but I think I would look at words like terms like emotional safety as well, and just the extent to which 2 people are able to co-construct that real feeling of emotional safety together at the foundation of their relationship. So that you can build atop of that a sex life that is novel, that is evolving, that is risk-taking. I mean, you also have to remember that sexuality is so shrouded in shame that even if we are very attached to one another, that doesn't necessarily mean that we can create, successful sexuality or create that sense of emotional safety, because we're so reluctant very often to have conversations about sex with our partners.
Yeah, that word's really good, emotional safety. Sue Johnson, obviously, she just passed away, very sad. But she was one of the people that wrote praise in the opening pages of your book. And so she was a legend in the field of attachment. And I was very curious about this as a sex therapist to get your take, but based on her work, she kind of outlined, I guess, 3 different types of sex that people have. She coined the first one, sealed off sex, solace sex, and synchrony sex. She said that sealed off sex is kind of more emotionally disconnected and detached. And that is kind of most commonly associated with hookups and one-night stands. Solace sex is when there's some sort of ambiguity about a relationship. So there's some sense of being anxious or unsure about where the relationship stands. So sex may be used to win over or confirm the approval of the other person. And I thought what's interesting about that one is it's kind of in alignment with some of the core themes that you outlined in your book, in terms of the motivating factors when it comes to having sex. And then the last one, synchrony sex, she used some pretty bold language. She said the way sex is supposed to be. She said it's the most satisfying type of sex because it's when emotional openness and responsiveness, tender touch, and erotic exploration all come together. This is a sex that fulfills, satisfies, and connects. The safer we feel emotionally, going back to
Mm-hmm.
what the word you just used, the more we can communicate, express our needs, play, and explore our responses and relax into sexual feelings. What's your take on kind of these three kind of levels that she outlined of sex?
I mean, I think people are always creating different types of sex and buckets of sex. I tend to think that there are sort of three broad types of sex in their most broadest form: procreative, relational, and recreational. And I deal with all three categories, but I think the two that Sue is touching on there in her own unique way with her own unique interpretations. I mean, Sue is also, a real monogamist, and I think she would have said that synchronous sex is only really possible probably in, the most emotionally safe, pair bond. And so she was a little less comfortable with some of the trends that are happening today around non-monogamy and polyamory and the extent to which emotional safety can also be occur in non-traditional relationships. But I tend to feel that most of the couples that I work with are having some version of relational sex. Sex is a source of intimacy. It's a source of connection. It's very much embedded in the overall relational context. I think when we think of relational sex, we often think of that sort of staring in each other's eyes, kind of sensual lovemaking. And then I think there's also this recreational approach to sex, which is much more about our sense of imagination and adventure, and maybe the pursuit of sex more in its in its own right as a source of pleasure. And I think many couples end up getting sort of trapped in the relational bucket and end up in sort of sex ruts because they're not bringing enough of the recreational into their sex lives. So I really talk to couples about trying to achieve what I would call kind of a relational approach to sex.
Like
having that, and I think this is probably what Sue would agree with, is having that strong just relational foundation and relational security in order to start to build a top of.
You had a lot to say about kind of properly understanding ourselves, obviously, as we move along with the science in terms of sexual libidos. And I think kind of what's been discovered in terms of there's been two types of desires or libidos, if you will: responsive desire and spontaneous desire. And can you explain how like those two things interact with our sexuality and our relationships?
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the biggest issues I deal with when it comes to couple sex, and I think that this would be true of most therapists dealing with sexuality, are desire discrepancy issues, mismatched libidos, couples getting stuck in sex ruts, or very often in sexless relationships. And I think very often at the root of that is each partner may end up being in a different desire framework, and they don't really understand their partner's desire framework. And so it's sort of like these two alien atmospheres almost trying to create one single sexual ecosystem. So the two different desire frameworks are, well, one, what I started to describe earlier, which would be that reactive desire framework, right? That's the guy who can come home, be on his phone, working, frustrated, even arguing with his partner, and then suddenly tap her on the shoulder and say, hey, let's have sex. And then sort of get rejected and feel hurt. And what's wrong? Why isn't my partner wanting to have sex right now? Because I'm feeling sexual in my body. I'm noticing how hot he or she is. And so again, I say he or she because men especially tend to often be in that reactive desire framework. And again, it's that immediate sort of kind of like green light, like, I'm in that framework, and I've been married for 25 years and I still find my wife really cute and sexy. And if she's coming out of the shower or getting dressed or something, I can, look at her and my reactive desire framework just gets triggered. Like if she were in the mood to have sex, like, hell, I'll come late to this podcast and try and accomplish both at, once. Now, unfortunately, or fortunately, my wife is not in that sort of classic reactive desire framework. Doesn't mean she doesn't have sexual thoughts or sexual urges or can't be sexually spontaneous, but like a lot of women, especially in long-term relationships, she tends to be in what would be called a responsive desire framework. So you're looking at sort of a spontaneous desire framework versus a responsive desire framework. And in a responsive desire framework, desire is not the first thing that you feel. It's like the second, the third, or even the fourth thing that one would feel. And to arrive at desire, for desire to respond or to turn on, there needs to be a set of preconditions. And in general, those preconditions need to be the generation of some kind of pleasure, some kind of connection. This is where we get into another concept, which is highly interrelated, which is called the dual control model, and this idea that
I was going to ask about that.
That each sexual brain has two systems that operate at once: a sexual excitation system and a sexual inhibition system. So think of a car that has an accelerator and a brake. Our accelerator is the sexual excitation system, which is basically our turn-on system. All the things that turn on, right? So my wife comes out of the shower, I can hit the accelerator very quickly. I can access my sexual excitation system. But I and everyone else, we also have a sexual inhibition system, our turn-off system, all our brakes, all the things that get in the way of turning on, from being tired, from being stressed out, to having a busy day, to not feeling good in our bodies, to not feeling trusting of our partners, or to being angry at our partners, to trauma, you name it. I mean, there's so much that can be on the excitation part of the excitation system, and so much that's part of the inhibition system. When we meet in the beginning of a relationship, and this is where things get confusing when we're drawn to another person, it's pretty much all excitation system. But as relationships go on, as you can imagine, our inhibitors, our brakes really pile up. I mean, I have 2 kids at home. Both are extremely challenging. I had a father who just died. My wife has some health conditions. We both have tremendous work responsibilities and frustrations, and we're dealing with our parents and our kids. I mean, the inhibitors so vastly outweigh the exciters. It's amazing that anybody's able to step on the gas. But as a guy, I can really access my excitation system very quickly. And so that's why I'm in what would be called that spontaneous desire framework. For many women, they're really in that responsive desire framework, meaning that if the inhibitors aren't lowered, if a foot isn't taken off the brakes, it's very, very, very hard to step on the gas. And so that's why for someone in a responsive desire framework, to get to desire, to get to sex, to get to arousal, there really needs, I guess, what we would call sort of a sex positive or a sex disposed environment in which those inhibitors are low and those exciters are high. So again, my wife can I could come out of the shower and my wife can see me and she could say, well, there's kind of a handsome guy that I'm sexually attracted to. It just doesn't click into that kind of palpable form of spontaneous desire that I feel, because she's also got to get to work and thinking about a million things. So we are in different desire frameworks. And that could be very, very frustrating. As a person in a spontaneous desire framework, I could say, well, what's wrong? Like, why am I always the one that has to initiate? Or why am I always the one that's feeling that desire? Why can't I be desired in that way? And for someone in a responsive desire framework, they're probably saying, geez, why is everything about sex? And like, how can this person just pivot into sex after having an argument or having no connection time or with everything, that has to be done, right? So it's almost like I said, living on two different planets and trying to create a shared planet, a shared desire framework.
Yeah, I think that it's so important to understand this, because if you're trying to change your partner, or like, it's like you're trying to go against gravity in a sense. And I think there's so many stereotypes in our society that like something is wrong with you if you don't have like a kind of spontaneous desire. And then you've also talked about, as a relationship goes on, and like how things might change even in yourself, and then like you think something's wrong with you if your sexual response changes, something's wrong with the relationship. And I think in understanding this framework, you can realize that everything is normal, and everything is natural in a sense. And we'll get to this later, but you have just kind of this brilliant model that you outlined in the book of like how to put together a quote unquote sex script of like that works with both of those things. And I think another way of putting the whole sexual excitation system and the inhibition system obviously is like the amount of things that are turning you off from sex is just like, for someone with a responsive desire, far outweighs the amount of things that are turning you on. And so you need to like consider that, and you need to consider that doesn't mean that your relationship can't work sexually if you have two different desire systems.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Not at all. I mean, I think what becomes important is, I think if you are partnered with someone who is in a responsive desire framework and you're in a spontaneous desire framework, the operative terms become terms like percolate, simmer, really create, allow arousal, allows those exciters to kind of start to percolate and simmer and allow those inhibitors to kind of start to turn off, get the turn-offs turning off and the turn-ons turning on in a way that kind of slowly unfolds over time. And then you'll arrive at sex every time, practically.
The other thing that I thought was fascinating, really fascinating, was the Masters-Johnson model of human sexual response, which is, I guess, how we actually move through a sexual encounter. And there's key differences between the male sexual response and the female sexual response. And you talked about, in your book, you outlined kind of like the 3 different resolutions that could kind of happen, like what happens to a male after an orgasm, and then the 2 different kind of resolutions that females typically would have. Can you explain that a little bit?
They were able to really ask the question, what happens in the body during sex? And they outlined kind of one of the first models of human sexual response, in which a person moved through arousal and kind of built up arousal, and then hit a kind of a peak or a plateau from which they would then have an orgasm, and then slowly resolve or come back to the pre-aroused state. As it turns out, men can kind of move through, and I think that this is probably where what you're exactly talking about, is that men can really move very, very quickly through arousal to orgasm and to a very quick resolution. Blood flows into the genitals, there is an ejaculation, and blood flows out of the genitals, and men return very quickly to the pre-aroused state. For women, it turns out to be different. Arousal, blood flow enters into the genitals more slowly. So arousal tends to be a slower process. Men don't really have that, what we would call that plateau phase, or that period before orgasm, from which orgasm kind of launches. Men just kind of go straight through to orgasm and straight down to the pre-aroused state. Women tend to cycle more slowly through arousal and then get to this phase of the plateau phase. You can imagine women are sort of at this slower arc up and then sort of have a longer plateau phase, while men are just kind of shooting up and down. So especially in that kind of plateau phase, men and women are often really missing each other. And this is one of the reasons why there's this term that's called the orgasm gap between men and women, where men much more consistently are able to have orgasms as a result of partnered sex than women are. Women are often left kind of abandoned by the arousal process in that plateau phase, which can feel really nice. It can feel really arousing. It just doesn't have the release of orgasm. So whereas men will tend to sort of go through the process, have orgasms, and come down, a lot of women end up becoming aroused during sex, ending up in this very pleasurable sort of plateau phase, but then are being left unresolved. And so they won't have orgasms, and blood will much more slowly leave the genitals. The other thing that can happen is that two partners can have an orgasm during sex. After a man ejaculates, blood will really vacate the genitals and a guy will return to that pre-aroused state. But just as it takes longer for blood to go into the female genitals, it also takes longer for blood to vacate the female genitals. And so women will go through arousal, go through that plateau phase, have an orgasm, and then rather than come right back down to the pre-aroused state in the way that men do, will go back into that plateau phase, into a kind of warmed up, into a warm phase in which there's still the potential to become re-aroused and to go back into orgasm. And so women have, unlike men, have a very natural organic capacity for multiple orgasms in a way that men do not. So that's sort of slight variations on the Masters and Johnson model.
Yeah, I think that's so fascinating. I think if you're a male listening or a female, you just immediately kind of resonate, understand that is that, like, you know, when a male has an orgasm, all of a sudden you could be like not in the mood at all in like 10 seconds, versus the difference on kind of how that tapers off for a female. And so, you know, given all the data we discuss, lots of great things, I want to touch on marriage for a second because of its relevance to the conversation. Obviously, polyamory is on the rise, but it's still in the minority. And so people typically still pursue long-term relationships with one another monogamously. And statistics show that 90% of people will have been married at some point by the time they're 50 years old. That doesn't mean that they are still married in that relationship, but so meaning the sexual context in which people will experience everything that we're talking about, at least eventually, will be marriage. So, you know, 9 out of 10 of us will at some point get up on an altar and proclaim monogamously that we're going to have sex with only this other person in our life. And so I'm really curious, like, when it comes to marriage, what you see in your office, because the idea of like a sexless marriage is something that people are afraid of happening to them, yet we all keep getting married and commit to, like, we're only going to have sex with this person. And obviously you've been married for over 20 years. So what are kind of some of the things that you're seeing that contribute to like a sexless marriage?
Well, I think the main thing that I see, which is probably somewhat of a generational difference, is that in working with especially millennial couples that are in sexless marriages, they were often sexless to begin with. They didn't arrive at sexlessness. A lot of couples in long-term monogamous relationships sometimes do arrive in sex ruts. And that has a lot to do with what we were calling the sexual inhibition system and the extent to which the inhibitors have really taken over, whether it's how we feel in our bodies or how our bodies function, or medications that we might be on, or simply waning attraction to our partner, or loss of trust, or loss of that emotional safety. So many people do arrive in sort of sex ruts or sexless marriages. And I think if desire was there, attraction, chemistry was there to begin with, very often it can be refound. And so I do help a lot of couples rediscover what was lost. But the thing that I'm also noticing quite a bit is that people really discount the importance of sexual chemistry and sexual attraction picking their partners for marriage. A lot of people enter into marriage with false beliefs about sex and marriage. They believe that, well, married couples stop having sex anyway, so I shouldn't overvalue sexual attraction and picking a partner. I should really focus on marrying my best friend, or marrying someone who's going to be a great parent, or going to be, the greatest companion in the world, or really get along with my family and friends. Some people now believe that you can't have sex and love in one person. And that has a lot, I think, to do with I don't know, trends in online dating and casual sex and hookup culture, and the belief that, you can't really have sane sex with, or sane relationships with someone that also have that strong sexual component. But I think the biggest myth that people often believe is, well, I may not feel the attraction now, but we have everything else going for us. Surely we'll be able to figure that out and create it. So I think the hardest issue that I deal with, and I'm dealing with increasingly, is couples that have sort of chosen from the beginning to really be in sexless relationships, whether they were admitting that or aware of that or not. And I do believe in core attraction. I do believe in kind of physical / sexual attraction and chemistry. And I have a hard time believing that that can be created if it wasn't there in the first place down the line, especially once all of those inhibitors stack up. So I think that we should very much, very, very much be privileged, especially if we're going to enter into monogamous relationships and we value monogamy and we're going to become the gatekeepers in some ways of each other's sexuality. Why would I not pick with, and I mean, I'll throw this back at you, with sexual attraction maybe being the most important quality? I mean, if sex is important, if it's a vital aspect of being alive, and we're going to enter into what we hope is a marriage for life, then why would we not privilege that, like, right at the top of the list, maybe even as number one?
Well, what I would say is, so obviously as we age, we potentially might look different than we once did. And then there's obviously something to be said about, let's just say somebody gets in an accident or they get sick and they don't look like they once did. So the sexual attraction that we once had. So I'm thinking about the mindset of somebody that you're talking about, the sexless marriage from the starter, that they would think that the sexual attraction might come later. And so, like, what would you say about that in terms of, like, aging, someone getting sick, things changing, and how that would impact the sexual state?
I believe that we have to nurture sexuality throughout our lives. We can't just ignore it. I mean, we need to take care of our bodies. We need to continue to do our best to try and remain, I think, physically and sexually attractive to our partners. There's certainly a lot of allowances to be made for aging or for health issues. But I think if there's a core attraction, that a couple cherishes and cultivates and keeps alive from the beginning of a relationship, there's no reason why it has to disappear. It may wane, it may change, it may diminish a little bit as we age, but that core. I work with plenty of couples. I have plenty of. I should actually say I don't work with them. I mainly know plenty of couples who are in long-term relationships who have been married longer than I have, and sex is still really a very vital and vibrant part of the relationship. So I don't at all buy into this idea that we age and we have to lose sex and it becomes monogamy or non-monogamy.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really good. What would you say to someone who's like, my spouse has just let themselves go or something like that? Because I'd imagine that is something that...
Yeah. We have sort of these sexual parts of ourselves. We have our sexual selves, and those parts of ourselves should not be exiled. They should have a seat at the table when we are, picking our partners in life, and I think our sexual selves should always have a seat at the table. And so we should always be working on keeping our sexual selves healthy. And part of that is, I think, doing your best to maintain your health and to, maintain, your level of attractiveness and to cultivate your sexual selves and to excite your sexual selves. So I think it's important for couples in long-term relationships to not be complacent, to try and feel and look their best, to keep their relationships exciting. You have to remember, in the beginning of a relationship, when you're falling in love, there's so much novelty, there's so much newness in the discovery of another person. And at a certain point, we can't keep discovering unless we're going on a journey of discovery together. So if I'm in a relationship where I've chosen to really let myself go, or my partner has, and we are no longer doing anything to keep our relationship, our couplehood interesting, exciting, vibrant, actualizing, then yeah, we're going to probably arrive at some sort of state of sexlessness. And rather than look internally, we'll probably look for a fast solution and say, okay, I don't know, cheat or something like that, or get divorced, or advocate for non-monogamy. So it does take work, but so does anything in a relationship. Raising kids takes work. Maintaining a home takes work. Maintaining jobs, a balanced distribution of effort and labor into a relationship. It all takes work. Why should sexuality not take work? Why should sexuality just be something that's automatic, organic, spontaneous? People really resist any notion that sexuality needs to be cultivated. It maybe needs to be scheduled. It needs to have its own track in a relationship that's being maintained.
Yeah, that's good. What about the emotional aspect of a relationship? How does that influence the kind of physical component of the relationship?
Well, I think it's both related. It's not either or, it is really both and. But I think it's sort of a little bit what we were talking about in the beginning, which is being able to have emotional safety with another person, feeling secure, feeling loved, feeling connected, feeling seen, heard, feeling trusting. Those are all really important qualities. They in themselves do not always promote sexual arousal. Trusting your partner isn't necessarily a turn-on. It may be a prerequisite to getting turned on. Having emotional safety is not necessarily a turn-on. It's a prerequisite potentially for being turned on. But I think that there is something about sex that exists along its own track, and I sometimes think about it as like food. We have to be able to see our partners as food. We have to be able to, in some ways, objectify our partners. We have to be able to want to use them for our own purposes. We have to have sexual hunger, and we want to have our appetites, satiated. And so I think, I work with a lot of couples, and they may be having sex, but what they lack is a feeling of being desired. People want to be desired. They want to be hungered for. They want to be the object of their partner's eyes. So that's its own thing. That's not just about like, oh, I love this person or I trust this person. So there's a couple of kind of tracks that need to combine.
Yeah, there's something so ugly about, I don't know, I think about like a woman being catcalled on the street, obviously the objectification there, but when you're in this marriage that you've committed yourself and whatever, obviously you want to feel desired and like a mutual thing going back and forth. And so I love that. I wanted to talk about, off camera, we're talking about like kind of religion and purity culture and all that stuff. And, you had a whole chapter in your book about sexual shame. And so where does that come up in your practice, in terms of like that interfering with the ability to have a healthy sex life?
Yeah. So I think that, we are all born into our lives, and we are all potential sexual beings. Some of us have the good fortune of being born into sex-positive environments. Some of us have the misfortune of being born into very sex-negative environments. But most of us end up, I think, being born into sex-avoidant environments. Sex is something that can be watched or seen in the movies, on TV, on the internet, but very few of us are raised in environments where sex is really promoted, talked about, modeled in healthy ways. It's not necessarily being modeled in negative ways in many instances, but it's being avoided. And I think the legacy of sort of growing up in a sex-avoidant home is that we never developed the vocabulary to talk about something that warrants words. Like so many couples I work with have almost literally never talked about sex with each other. They've actually never maybe even said 100 words about sex to each other. They just sort of expect it to be something that happens. But it's a topic that sexuality is an area of life that warrants words. And if we don't have words to talk about, to create an intersubjective experience, meaning our subjectivities coming together and having conversations with each other, then we're going to sort of live in silence, and we're going to feel embarrassed or shamed or shy at wanting to share a sexy dream or a sexual fantasy or a position that we like, or talking about some sort of sexual problem that we may be trying to resolve. So I think sexual shame, as I see it in my practice, is directly linked to avoidance of the topic, which goes back to the home environment in which we were born and raised.
I think a lot of that partially stems back, obviously, I had mentioned at religion, but like kind of this narrative that sex is only procreative is a big part of the equation. And obviously, I don't think that that's a narrative that maybe younger millennials or Generation Z are hearing currently today, but you can't dismiss the impact that has had on culture of being like, people trying to fuse their spirituality and their sexuality and make sense of those two things. And you're hearing like, well, God made sex to be procreative. And you had this whole kind of story in the sexual shame about kind of the origins of it with St. Augustine. Do you want to share about that a little bit?
It's an interesting question. Like, why are we so screwed up around sex? Like, why do we have to have so much shame and taboo? Like, why? Why is it such a forbidden, taboo topic? It's such an innate part of just our lived lives, over time. And so, I think religious prohibition has a lot to do with our attitudes around sex. And when you say, well, why did certain religions start to really prohibit sex? Certainly in Christian religion, some of that goes back to Saint Augustine, who is probably the most one of the most influential
One of the most famous.
religious figures, and he just had if you read his confessions, he had a very confusing relationship with his own sexuality. You read the confessions, and he reads very much like a reformed sex addict. He talks about, lust being these wild, barbaric, polluting forces that he struggled with, and he suffered sexual humiliations. He had sexual and romantic infatuations that were thwarted by his parents, and so he also had just a very sex negative view, and so as he was gaining more and more influence and power, those sex negative views really just became part of his philosophy. And ultimately, he believed that sex was a dirty, corrupting force, and that people shouldn't have sex at all. In his ideal world, people wouldn't have sex at all, but then because Jesus would come and there'd be salvation and wouldn't be necessary to be sexual. But while we are waiting for the second coming of Jesus, it turned out it was going to take more time than Augustine originally accounted for. So people will need to have sex, and they will need to procreate. And so mainly sex should be a procreative experience in the context of marriage, which should be designed purely for procreation and not for pleasures. Augustine described what he thought of as ideal sex, which would be as little motion, as little movement, as little pleasure as possible, and with the sole purpose of procreation. He had also experienced very sort of embarrassing erections as a youth, and so he hated this idea that we had this sort of involuntary response that we could not bring under voluntary control. And so he also very much felt that it should be a very, very sort of we should be able to really tell ourselves it's time to have an erection to procreate. And so that became his view of sex, and he was very influential, and I think that's kind of what got rolling.
Yeah, I think anybody listening to this some people listening to this who might have grown up in the church, I think what's interesting is if you plot Augustine at a point in history, I don't know if it was like the year 400 or something, but you still feel the influence of that, even 20 years ago or whatever, with purity culture and all the problems. And I personally found the entire topic to be ironic because none of that stuff actually comes from the Bible. So if you're someone that is trying to make sense of spirituality and sexuality, there is a more sex positive view in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. There's actually an entire book of the Bible, the Song of Songs, that is filled with erotic imagery and dedicated to sexual love. And the Proverbs, which is basically a book of wisdom, it literally says, let her breast be your satisfaction and let her embrace intoxicate you at all times. So this is obviously pointing to the pleasure-oriented nature of sex. And
I'm not a religious scholar at all, but from what I understand, Augustine's views, were not, widely held by his peers at the time, and he was considered, fairly offbeat. He, from what I understand, really took the story of Adam and Eve, which was really a story about kind of obedience and law, and behavioral consequence. And there wasn't really anything in there to say that their sin was, sexual in nature. But Augustine worked really, really hard to interpret the story of Adam and Eve and their sin primarily being the sin of sex.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, and I don't want to paint the Bible as something that is in complete alignment with the culture today, and that there isn't any scaffolding and like anything goes. But and I think that the Bible ultimately would probably be more in alignment with what Sue Johnson had outlined with synchrony sex and stuff like that, and safety and secure attachment and sexual exploration. Obviously, there's something to be said about marriage as well. But
good marriage.
Yeah, obviously, who wants to be in a terrible marriage? It's actually ironic. You probably haven't heard of this before, but like I couldn't help but think about the kind of principles that Jesus advocated for when I saw the name "she" comes first, in the sense that the way of Jesus is all about like self-sacrificial love, and segmented under that, which we don't think about when it comes to spirituality and sexuality, is like sex and the art of like pleasuring your partner. And an author here, Tim Keller, he wrote in a book of A Meaning of Marriage, he said, each partner in marriage is to be most concerned not with getting pleasure, but with giving it. In short, the greatest sexual pleasure should be the pleasure of seeing your spouse getting pleasure. When you get to the place where giving arousal is the most arousing thing, you're practicing this principle. And so I just thought when I read "She Comes First," it was so fascinating because, our culture doesn't do that. It's like generally, at least 20 years ago, which I still feel like is somewhat true now, everything is oriented around the male orgasm and the whole sexual experience. Even when you look at Hollywood and film, it's all about like this whole sexual experience that happens. The male has an orgasm, boom, scene ends type of thing. And it's not so much focused on the female orgasm. And so why do you think that is? Like where a guy expects to get off, blowjobs are the norm, but like even going back to your book, it's like cunnilingus is not the norm. Right. And so why do you think that is?
Right. Well, I think that, look, I just think of my own sexual journey and the extent we're just sort of indoctrinated into accepted beliefs that, intercourse is the main way of having sex. I mean, who questions that these days? I mean, I certainly do, and I espouse questioning that, but most people that you ask, and most of the couples that I work with that are even dealing with sexual problems, heterosexual couples would say, that, intercourse is sex. And if you're not having intercourse, you're just involved in some sort of, sexual play. And so, okay, so we accept that intercourse is sex. Well, the vagina has very few sensitive nerve endings internally, right? So all of the sensitive nerve endings that actually contribute to the female orgasm are primarily located on the surface of the vulva, with the clitoris being the most sensitive part of the female vulva. And the part of the clitoris that's actually external is just a small part of an internal structure that largely wraps around just the very entrance to the vagina. We're talking about like the first inch, right? So in large part, this idea of having, a big penis that can penetrate hard and deep is kind of a misnomer, because there are few, if any, sensitive nerve endings inside the vagina, right? So automatically then we are privileging a sex act, intercourse, that really is not the main sexual behavior that promotes mutual sexual gratification. And so if intercourse is the main sexual act, which not only men, but a lot of women believe as well, then a lot of men and women are willing to discount the female orgasm as something that's being essential or even important to sex. I mean, I meet more and more women today who will say, well, partnered sex isn't about orgasm. When I want to have an orgasm, that's something that I do with my hands or with my vibrator. Partnered sex is about, connection, pleasure, and fun, but it's not about having an orgasm. I mean, you would meet very, very few men who would say, well,
would say that,
partnered
yeah.
sex isn't about, having an orgasm. But, again, all of the nerve endings that really contribute to female pleasure are on the surface of the vulva, and there's a distance. There's what's called a clitorovaginal distance between what we would call the clitoris, or the head of the clitoris, the glands of the clitoris, and the vaginal entrance. And that can be anywhere from, an inch to an inch and a half between the vaginal entrance and the clitoris. And so if you're someone that's primarily engaging in intercourse as the main sexual behavior, which 90% of heterosexual couples do. In fact, I mean, I've done informal surveys of my own client base and of heterosexual couples talking about the last time they had sex. Close to 100% will say that they either attempted to have intercourse or had intercourse. And if you ask that couple, how long did it take you to get to intercourse? Most will say anywhere from 2 to 7 minutes. And so the vast majority of a sexual event is dedicated to intercourse. So that means the vast majority of a sexual event is dedicated to a behavior that does very little to directly stimulate the nerve endings that are all wrapped up in the clitoris. And so as a result, you then have men saying, well, something must be wrong with her if she's not having an orgasm. But very more often you have women who are also saying, well, something must be wrong with me. What can I do to have vaginal orgasms?
Which is, I just thought this was just completely wild when I was reading your book, because I had no idea that the inner walls of the vagina actually have very few nerve endings, but the clit has over 8,000 nerve endings, and there's just this depiction in media of this simultaneous orgasm, but it's almost impossible to achieve. And so when you're watching a movie or a film and they have some sort of sex scene or something, it's this ramp and then this moaning, and then it's just they both orgasm, and then it's just but that's not actually how it works, really.
And when you consider what we were talking about with Masters and Johnson and the difference between men and women's arousal arcs, right, and that men tend to cycle through the arousal process much more quickly and can reach ejaculation or reach orgasm before women, and then you also look at the importance of outer course versus intercourse, you tend to arrive at the philosophy of she comes first, which is, outer course based asynchronous orgasms in general, in which female partners are usually having an orgasm first, followed by a male orgasm, especially when you consider the potential for women to organically have multiple orgasms.
Given the data around penetration and what actually stimulates the female orgasm best, does penis size actually matter?
Does penis size matter? I would say no. At most, what matters is penis girth, potentially, not length, but actual girth, and that would be because, so look, the vulva, the surface of female sexual anatomy, has a lot of nerve endings, both in the labia and in the clitoris, but it's hard to describe, but the clitoris has sort of an internal structure that wraps around internally the entrance to the vagina. And so if you want to stimulate those structures, then you would want to be stimulating the walls of the vagina or the vaginal entrance. And so that's where girth would matter more than length, to be able to create that friction or that vibration against those nerve endings.
So you think culturally, is it just more of a preference or a turn on for females, that it's just he has a big penis, something like that?
Well, there was there have been some studies done of, what size penis do women really prefer, which is different than the question, what size penis do men believe that women
Yeah.
prefer? Okay, so most men are operating under their own belief of what women value, and I'm not saying that women don't appreciate penis size, but there was a study done, believe it was by Nicole Prouse, and I can't accurately totally describe the research environment, but she basically took these 3D printers and printed up a whole bunch of different penises, models of penises of different sizes and girths, from micro penis to quite large, and she asked women to pick the penis that they would most like to have sex with in terms of these various models. And I think the vast majority picked penis sizes that were either close to average or just a little bit above average.
Wow. I want to get to the sex script in a second, to put everything we've been talking about together. But one last kind of myth from our culture that I feel like is interfering with living out a kind of healthy sexuality is, this idea that men are designed to be kind of sexual savants and last for hours on end during penetrative sex. But you wrote, and I think this was like a study maybe from a while ago, but is it true that the typical male sustains penetrative thrusting on average for about 2.5 minutes?
Yeah, I mean, there's a range from about 2.5 minutes to about 6 minutes. Again, if you're engaging in sex that's arousing and absorbing, you shouldn't need to have to, be able to maintain an erection for hours and hours. So the average man maintains penetrative thrusting from anywhere from around 2.5 to 5 minutes. And so I think that just talks about the importance of also being able to combine intercourse with outercourse and develop sexual events that are not entirely intercourse dependent, especially if we're looking to create mutual pleasure.
Yeah, that stat is just kind of wild to me, because I feel like there's all these expectations that are like being set around this stuff, and you had all this stuff later in your book about ejaculation and the anxieties that come around that, and all this stuff, and so we're digesting all these narratives and thinking that that's the way that it's supposed to be, but like the data shows that like if this is happening for most people during penetrative thrusting, then obviously most people are just like lying or making up the fact that is not happening to them or something like that. And I think that,
Yeah, well, a lot of, this is, again, like if we talk about sex scripts and what does an individual sexual event look like for us, like if I'm a fly on the wall and if I'm working with a couple and they're talking about these sexual problems they have, and I said, well, tell me about the last time you had sex, which was the title of my book, I'm asking them to basically describe the script of their last sexual event. Well, for most couples, sex does tend to follow a script that becomes repetitive over time. And if it works, great. It might never become an issue. But generally, our sex scripts that we develop at a personal level are created in relationship to the cultural sex scripts that also we follow. And so what are those cultural sex scripts? We already discussed a couple of them. Sex equals vaginal penetration. Vaginal penetration should last a certain amount of time. Penises should be a certain length. Men should show up or be able to show up with certain types of erections. Men think about sex every 7 seconds. So why wouldn't a guy always be in a state of constant desire? These are all sort of cultural scripts around sex that inform our personal sex scripts.
Yeah. Yeah. So getting into that, the sex script, can you explain what that word means? Like when you say sex trip?
Yeah. So again, I will work with couples. They'll come to me in a first session. They'll talk about the sexual problems they're having. Maybe one partner doesn't feel enough desire, or one partner's not having orgasms, or one partner feels like the sex is boring, or doesn't include a behavior that they really love, or that the sex isn't adventurous enough. So for me, in order to understand the sexual problem, I need to understand sort of what a typical sexual event looks like. So I'll often ask a couple or an individual to tell me about the last time they had sex. And in asking that question, I'm basically asking them to describe a sex script, or the sequence of behaviors that unfolded. How did you decide to have sex? When and where did sex take place? Who initiated? How did you get into sex? What were the activities that you engaged in? What activities didn't you engage in? How did you generate arousal with your bodies? Did you use your minds at all? Who had orgasms? Who didn't? In what sequence were the orgasms? What did the moments following sex look like? Were they connected? What is the erotic thread, or the space in between sexual events? How do your sexual selves show up during the day or in the evening when you're not necessarily going to have sex? Do your sexual selves only show up just for sex, and otherwise you're just sort of putting them in the background? So all of that sort of constitutes what I call the sex script.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
No, that makes total sense. And so, you had these models in kind of the back half of your book. And so obviously the first component of that is, we're kind of backing up a little bit, coming into this, recognizing attachment styles, inhibitors, like accelerators, all of that stuff that we talked about, spontaneous, responsive desire. And so when you're kind of starting up, can you talk to me about how we can kind of properly address the desire discrepancy? Let's just say starting with spontaneous and responsive, if that's a situation.
Well, I think we talked a lot about desire frameworks and creating a shared desire framework. And first off, understanding what framework are we each in? I mean, if we are two partners who are in the early part of a relationship, we may both be in a spontaneous desire framework. And so getting started, may not be the issue at all. If we are two partners who are in a responsive desire framework, we may not be coming in at all, because even though we're not having sex, we may not actually miss it. I mean,
forget.
Yeah. I mean, I work with a lot of couples in which the person in the responsive desire framework can't remember the guy in the spontaneous desire framework, or that partner will remember, we had sex exactly 6 days ago, and 8 hours ago. And a woman might say, well, we just had sex yesterday, or I don't remember when it was. So you take two people in a responsive desire framework, because again, in a responsive desire framework, desire emerges from a process of sort of percolating arousal, and that arousal comes from stepping on the gas and stepping off the brake. But if that process is never happening, then desire literally doesn't come into existence. And are you going to miss something that you're not feeling, that doesn't really exist? Maybe at a cognitive level, at the level of having a memory about it, you may miss it. But in your body, you're probably not going to end up missing it.
Yeah, that's really good.
So the first thing would just be understanding what are our respective desire frameworks, and what do we each need to activate desire. And very often in a spontaneous / responsive model, we're going to need to figure out how to percolate arousal together.
Yeah, and then getting into, you mentioned this briefly before, the idea of outercourse versus intercourse, because so many people, just jump into intercourse. And so what would you say? Can you explain outercourse a little bit and the importance of that?
Yeah. So once we've decided to have sex, the question is, how are we turning each other on
Yeah.
mutually? And as we said, with many heterosexual couples, they'll go almost straight to intercourse. And so they're avoiding a lot of stuff. They're avoiding the kissing, the fooling around, the above the neck talking and fantasizing, the sensual stimulation of each other's bodies. They're potentially missing out on manual stimulation of the genitals and oral stimulation of the genitals, all behaviors that we would consider outer course because they're not intercourse.
Yeah.
So as part of a sex script, we want to engage in a lot of outer course. And again, it's not that we're engaging in outer course so that we can arrive at intercourse. Intercourse is just one behavior that rests alongside all of those other behaviors. But we basically want to create a sex script in which the behaviors are promoting the development of arousal towards orgasm. So, for example, you can have a lot of couples who go straight to intercourse, and so there's no outer course, there's no development of arousal, and we're lucky if one partner manages to achieve arousal and have an orgasm, much less both partners. But you can also dive into outer course in a way in which it's not sequenced appropriately. I mean, generally, couples tend to get below the waist extremely quickly and are ignoring just a lot of possibilities for outer course, both psychologically and physiologically.
As you're in this dance of just like with the desire discrepancy and understanding your partner and kind of catering to their needs, like what would you have to say to, let's just say, the spontaneous person who's like, I just want to have a quickie, right? And then there's the alternative of like catering to the person that's responsive and kind of like going with that flow. You think there's like a dance there in terms of like accommodating for both those things?
Sure. I mean, again, sex doesn't have to be about orgasm. It doesn't have to be about deep states of arousal. For many people, you could be working with a partner who it takes some time to kind of get absorbed in sex and turn off, and requires a lot of thinking about the environment and really getting relaxed. For some people, the idea of a quickie might be really enticing. We should just have, expectations. Maybe a quickie is about just an expression of really palpable desire, or maybe it's about one partner being able to have an orgasm in that kind of accelerated event. I think it's just about understanding what are the pleasures available to us. And the pleasures, by no means, I hope I'm not overemphasizing the importance of orgasm, because there are plenty of people who love quickies, and they love them, but they're not expecting to necessarily have orgasms as a result of them.
I think a big piece of this equation, which you've covered a lot, is I think just communicating about sex is so, people find it to be so awkward. And it's like, you almost get in this thing in relationships where it's like people are supposed to like mind read, and you're supposed to just know everything. And, communicating likes and dislikes, even communicating a fantasy to a spouse or your partner could just feel so awkward or I don't know, vulnerable. And so what's your starting point for like communication around these subjects and getting into that flow of like this is becoming natural for us to communicate about it?
Right. Well, I think that there's two kinds of communication. There's the kind of communication that would be a little maybe instructional and or educational, like here's what I like, here's what turns me on, here's what I need to be able to get turned on, here's the kind of sex that makes sense, or the environment in which to have sex, or what does work or doesn't work. And then there's the kind of conversation that's meant to promote arousal itself. I mean, There have been studies that have shown that women can fantasize their way to orgasm without ever even touching themselves, just using their imaginations.
That's crazy.
Men can certainly get very powerful erections just through watching something or thinking about something, remembering something. So that really points to psychological stimuli really being a very potent source of arousal, maybe much more so even than physical and sensual stimuli. So when we talk about sexual communication, I think we're talking about a couple of different modes of communication. One mode, let's talk about it. I mean, I'm just thinking, again, a little off the top of my head, but let's talk about like planning like an anniversary dinner together, right? One part of it would be like, well, let's schedule it. What day does our anniversary fall on? Where do we want to go to dinner? What's our favorite restaurant? Can we get a reservation? What do we agree on the kind of food that we want to have? And let's say we get all of that figured out so that we're going to have the perfect anniversary meal. Fantastic. Well, we had to do a lot of talking just to figure it out, right? I didn't mind read. We didn't, mind read. What do they call it? Mind read? Whatever. Sorry.
Telepathy.
Yeah. We didn't telepathically communicate all of that. And then we get to the restaurant. And then we really want to enjoy that meal. And if we've really put a lot of planning into it and it rocks, like we're going to appreciate and savor every detail. We're going to communicate how it tastes. We're probably going to even hold food out to our partner. You got to try this, and we're going to vocalize about it. That's something else that we should be doing during sex as well. The appreciation of the sex, the vocalization of the sex, the talking about how amazing it is, or what it's, all of that.
I part of that, I guess, is also understanding your own anatomy, your body. I have trouble with this word, but it's kind of like sexual hotspots, or is it erogenous zones?
Erogenous zones.
Okay, sorry, erogenous zones. And so is that kind of a self-discovery process? But I guess let's back up. Can you explain what those are?
Well, the whole body is an erogenous zone.
Yeah.
I mean, I think this idea that we have very, very specific erogenous zones. Like, sure, some people may say, well, my nipples are super sensitive. I love to have my nipples squeezed or kissed, or my butt, or certainly the penis or the vulva are erogenous zones. But the skin, our entire bodies can really be erogenous zones, and especially if we're adding in psychological arousal, then our entire experience of sex can be an erogenous zone. But an erogenous zone would just be what is a sensitive part of, classically an erogenous zone would be what is a sensitive part of the body that stimulates sexual arousal.
Yeah. I love what you wrote about kind of aftercare. And so you have the whole entire set script, you have the whole entire experience that unfolds. But you also talked about the importance of what happens in the moments after. So can you talk about aftercare a little bit?
Sure. I mean, couples who just sort of take sex and orgasm sort of for granted should also be thinking about aftercare and allowing time to, whether it's connect or to cuddle, to talk, to reflect, that period following orgasm, or the period, that on the other side, that's also a rich period in a sexual event to really connect. And then as an extension of that, I talk a lot about developing an erotic thread, because as we said earlier, some people really mainly just also want to feel desired by their partners. They don't want to shut down their sexual selves except for the occasional time that they may be having sex. They want to feel sexually alive all the time. So how do we maintain, flirtation? How do we continue to bring a little bit of our sexual appetites into our lived daily lives without necessarily having to have, full sexual events?
That's good. Yeah, we have a little bit of time left. So I kind of wanted to close with it's kind of more rapid fire questions, just that might be on people's mind. Um, do you feel like it's possible to move forward after infidelity?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I work with couples who are dealing with infidelity all the time. And I think recovery from infidelity has very much to do with the nervous system of the relationship. And I guess by that, I mean, some people are able to recover quite quickly. Some people, it takes an awful lot of time and healing. It's like a wound. How quickly do your wounds heal? And some people, frankly, aren't ever able to heal from a wound, although they may keep trying and trying and trying. But for the couples who do successfully heal from infidelity, I think very often they can become stronger. And I mean that truly. I think sometimes in life, we're just sort of going through life kind of side by side with each other. Oh, we're dating, we're going through courtship, we're getting married, we're even having kids and educating our kids. But it's the moments of adversity that really often bring us face to face, and being able to survive those moments of adversity together can really contribute to our growth and actualization. And so infidelity is certainly a breach of trust and an adversity that many couples can survive and find that it's ultimately a source of growth and even deeper connection.
Yeah, that's really good. Another one is, how does someone's sexual past influence a relationship? And I'm really thinking about trauma. I'm thinking about, rape, or even just, people love using the term body count today, but the previous number of sexual partners that they've had. Right. How do you feel like that influences like a present relationship, especially like a long-term kind of monogamous type of relationship?
Yeah, well, some people, I mean, again, buy into this sort of cultural belief that like I haven't had enough sexual experience, or my partner hasn't had enough sexual experiences, or I didn't get to have enough, and I don't believe that to me is more of a cultural script that you should have had a certain amount of partners or experiences, and without those partners or experience, you can't be a sensitive, sexual human soul. I don't think that that's true at all. I think everybody at every point in their life has the capacity to become and to be fully sexual, embodied human beings. I think for many of us, our sexual development can be displaced, disturbed, distorted, often through negative sexual experiences, through trauma. And I think that can really cause the body and the mind to say no to sex, to perceive sex as dangerous and something to avoid, and create very conflicted relationships with sexuality. I do think that healthy sexual experiences that involve kind of emotional safety and trust, and that trust and safety is validated with pleasure and arousal, I think those experiences can be incredibly reparative. So sex causes trauma. Sex also offers reparative experiences.
That's really good. The last question I have is, what do you think the purpose of sex is?
I think there are a few purposes. I think the purposes of sex, just thinking about my own marriage, are it's a source of fun, it's a source of connection, it's a source of pleasure, it's a source of satiation, it's a source of energy, it's a source of resilience, it's a source of growth. It's all of those things.
Yeah, that's really good. Well, thank you so much. I really enjoy this conversation.
Yeah, me too. Thank you, Matthew.
Yeah, there's so much value in everything that you've kind of put forth today, and I think people are going to get a lot out of this. So thank you for being here.
Very welcome. Thank you. Yeah. I appreciate it.